Well, as I promised last episode that we're going to have Nehemia Gordon back, we are delving into the ancient Hebrew Matthew, and also we will be getting into the Hebrew Revelation, the Gospel of the Revelation, the fifth Gospel, as I call it, the good news of the Messiah, Yeshua reigning as Messiah and King and Judge over the whole earth. And with Nehemia Gordon back with us, I realized that last week we didn't even get to the opening verse of what we were going to do because there are so many great things to share. Nehemia, thanks for coming back.
Thanks, Michael, for having me back.
This is incredible. As I began last week, Bible prophecy is being fulfilled in the land of Israel. What the prophets spoke 2,000 years ago, more than 2,000 years, 2,600 years ago, are now coming to pass. And it's really, they are continuing the revelation that Moses gave us right in the very beginning, that Israel would be scattered throughout the nations of the earth and then brought back in the last days, and the revelation that would happen. And so I want to stop for just a minute because we really left off with the first words of Yeshua after the resurrection in the Hebrew Matthew.
Right, and his first two words in the Hebrew version of the Gospel of Matthew, preserved by Jewish rabbis, this Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew, was Yehovah Yoshia. In the manuscript, it appears as Hashem Yoshiachem, which is, in the original would be Yehovah Yoshia, Yehovah will save, which is the meaning of his name. And, you know, and we had been talking before about how, the name has this relevance for all mankind, the name of the Father. Mm-hmm. You know, there's this great verse in the Psalms where it talks about all nations proclaiming the name. And
let me take everyone to Jeremiah. I'm going to read right out of the King James here. Everyone out there can follow along with me. I always recommend the King James. It'll always be my favorite English version of the Bible. And Jeremiah chapter 16. And in verse 14. Oh, wait. Yeah, we could go all the way back to the first verse in the first chapter, but we got to start here someplace.
Jeremiah 16.
We're going to start Jeremiah 16, verse 14. Therefore, and whenever you see the word therefore, what's the therefore? Therefore, it's because of the preceding context of Israel being scattered through the nations of the world. Therefore, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, as it says, I'm reading King James, the days come, saith the Lord, that it shall no more be said, the Lord liveth, that brought up the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, but the Lord liveth that brought up the children of Israel from the land of the north and from all the lands whither he had driven them, and I will bring them again into the land that I gave unto their fathers. This is Moses' prophecy now being repeated for the last days. How do you see that? Living in the land of Israel.
I got to tell you, Michael, this is one of the prophecies that I can look back over my life, and I've seen it fulfilled literally. You know, you have to understand, so when I was a kid, we very young, we would talk about, every year we do the Passover Seder, and we're remembering the Exodus from Egypt. And, and this was the big thing. God took us out of Egypt. But in the 1980s, when I was very young, so the big movement in the Jewish world in America was this was the motto, Free Soviet Jewry. There were over 1 million Jews living in the Soviet Union, and they were being persecuted. And you saw this banner on the front of synagogues all over America. It was a Star of David wrapped in chains. Mm-hmm. And the motto there was Free Soviet Jewry. And a few years ago, I was reminded of what a big deal this was, that at the time, I heard a lecture a few years ago, and it was recorded in 1986. And they were asking this activist in the Free Soviet Jewry movement, they said, how is this going to end? How are these Jews ever going to be freed from the Soviet Union? And you have to understand, for example, Nathan Sharansky, who was like one of the symbols of the movement, he officially requested to be let out of the Soviet Union and be allowed to go to Israel. And they said, if we let out the Jews, they called it a brain drain. They said, we need you. We got to hold on to you guys. You're our professors. You're our intellectuals, and other things too. But and he was thrown in prison, and he was in prison for decades. And they called him a refusenik. He was refused leaving the Soviet Union. They had such a wonderful, idyllic system you couldn't leave. And so they asked this activist, how will this ever end in 1986? And at the time he said, this will be a generations-long struggle The Soviet,
generations long.
He said, we will be fighting this. Our great-grandchildren will be fighting this battle to free our people. And maybe if we get really successful, we'll get a few dozen out one year and a few hundred out another year. And over time, we'll eventually free our people from the chains of the Soviet Union of communism. And then in 1991, the Soviet Union fell. And 1.1 million Jews came to Israel. And
1.1 million.
1.1 million came to Israel. Hundreds of thousands more went to Western countries, and the chains fell away. And imagine that 5 years earlier in 1986, the greatest experts in the world said this will be our great-grandchildren will be fighting to free these people. And today they're free. It's a fact of history that we can look back on now. And I read this here in verse 15, and it says, they're no longer going to say, as Yehovah lives, that's what it says in the Hebrew, as Yehovah lives, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, but as Yehovah lives, who brought the children of Israel from the land of the north. Look on the map, Michael. What's north of Israel? The Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, today Russia and Ukraine and Belarus and all those countries. And this is, Jeremiah was talking literally about what happened in the 1990s, and it's continuing to happen. He talked about in all the lands where I have cast them out there, and I will return them to their land that I gave to their fathers. It's literally happened in the last 70 years, what Jeremiah spoke about 2,600 years ago.
Yeah, let's look at this historically. This is a mighty thing. When the Almighty brought us out of the land of Egypt, how many came out of the land of Egypt?
It was 600,000 males, and then when they returned from Babylon, we're told 42,360 returned. Let's assume those are heads of household, right?
Okay,
and be really generous with our numbers and say it was 400,000. It's probably less, right? But let's say somewhere in that neighborhood, 400,000 people returned. 1.1 million came. And I got to tell you, Michael, I moved to Israel in 1993 and went to the Ministry of Absorption, where new immigrants to Israel go to find out, okay, you got to get all your papers. And they had been prepared for what they normally received. And what they normally received is 10,000 people a year. I sat in line once for 3 days because they just weren't ready for it. It came out of nowhere.
3 days in line.
Over 1 million people showing up. They were not prepared for it. Nobody expected it. And the prophecy was fulfilled overnight. And look, back in 1986.
Yehovah lives.
He lives. Back in 1986, when this activist for free over Jewry is talking about this, one of the things he said, we'll never overpower the Soviet Union. They have thermonuclear weapons. We can't force them to let them go. They'll never let them go. And so this will be generations where we get a few dozen out here and a few hundred there. And they just left. I mean, it's fulfillment of prophecy. When I was 12 years old and read this prophecy, it made no sense. What's he talking about? Nothing in history has been momentous as the exodus from Egypt. We were slaves in Egypt, and God took us out. Nothing could be as big as that. And then within my lifetime, these words were fulfilled. They're fact now. It's incredible. Jeremiah spoke the truth. His prophecy has been fulfilled in our lifetimes and continues to be fulfilled. He's returning to the people to the land of their fathers.
Right, and they came into a land that was already prepared. It was already set up. And now we go into these next verse. Behold, I will send for many fishers, saith the Lord, and they will fish them. And I will send for many hunters, and they shall hunt them out from every mountain, from every hill, and out of the holes of the rocks. That's what we saw with what happened with Germany. With Germany, every Corrie ten Boom's father's watch shop, every crevice, the Jews being hunted out and being exterminated, and that really, because the fishers came first, come on back, the whole movement to come back into the land of Israel.
Right. And what I think about with this passage, particularly in the return of the Jews from Israel to Israel, the ingathering of the exiles is the Jews of Yemen. And the Jews of Yemen lived under Islamic rule, the most backward you could imagine. I mean, if a Jewish man died and he had 8 kids, his widow was forcibly remarried to a Muslim man, and his children were raised as Muslims. The Jews of Yemen were required by civil law, by the law of the Sultan, to collect the garbage, because it wasn't dignified for a Muslim to have to do that. So they gave that job to the Jews and didn't pay them for it. It was just civic duty, like paying your taxes, right? I mean, it was just, they were forced to do it. And so they lived in the most backward conditions. I mean, they were living, they were living in the Bronze Age up until the 1950. And what happened was Israel was established in 1948. And there had been Jews who came from Yemen who escaped and went to Israel back in the 1800s. Mm-hmm. And they had their heart for their brothers. They said, what can we do to get our brothers out of this land? And so they sent agents into Yemen and went to every nook and cranny. I mean, there were people living in caves and on hillsides, and they were hiding out from the sultans to kidnap their wives. They used to marry off girls at 12, because if they waited till 13, the Muslims would come and kidnap the girls and raise them as Muslim wives. They were living in the worst conditions that I don't think there was any Jewish community other than Nazi Germany, right, which was for a 12-year horrible period. But even the Jews of Russia didn't suffer as badly as the Yemenite Jews. And so what they did, and it's a really interesting historical kind of twist. So they rented a bunch of, I think they were DC-10s, if I'm not mistaken, from Alaska Airlines. And they landed them in Sana'a in Yemen, and then they had sent their people out to bring all the Jews of Yemen to the capital, loaded them on planes. And you have to understand, these people didn't know what an airplane was.
Oh, yeah,
so they explained to them,
they
said,
a silver bird.
You know what they told them? They were out in the hill country living in caves, and they said, we've brought magic carpets and we're going to fly you to the land of Israel. And they said, what do you mean? That's something of legend. That's the stories of Aladdin that they'd heard, the 1001 Arabian Nights. They knew that kind of legend from the culture. Magic carpets? You're going to take us to... This is the fulfillment of the prophecies of Jeremiah and of Isaiah and Ezekiel. This can't be true. This can't be true. And on faith, they went to the capital and they got on planes and they flew out. And they arrived in Israel, and you have to understand, these people had just come out of basically the Bronze Age. And they had come to Israel, which even in 1950 was a relatively advanced technological country. Mm-hmm. And these were people who, they didn't know how to cross the street. They didn't know to look left and right when you cross the street because they'd never seen cars. I mean, Imagine that. And you have the same thing of the Jews who came from Ethiopia in the 1980s, that they would cross the street and get hit by a car because they'd never seen a car. I mean, you have a fulfillment of these prophecies literally in the 20th and 21st century. I mean, we read about these things. I remember reading this when I was a little kid thinking, what? There'll never be anything as significant as the Exodus from Egypt, right? But 600,000 males came out of Egypt. Let's say it was 2 or 3 million people, right? So we've had more than that in my lifetime that have been gathered back to Israel from the most barbaric, backward places in the world, from the gulags of the Soviet Union, from Siberia, Ethiopia, before I was born, from Yemen. I mean, within my lifetime and the lifetime of my parents and in your life, these things have been fulfilled. I mean, it's amazing.
And even as far and as deep and dark as Chicago.
There you go. From the streets of Chicago, which I barely survived.
Let me continue here.
Yeah.
For my eyes are upon all their ways. They are not hid from my face. Neither is there iniquity hid from my eyes.
Mm-hmm. He sees everything.
Right. And even though, so there's iniquity, there's sin. Right. I mean, you go to the land of Israel, and it's certainly not a Torah-observant world, Tel Aviv or any place else around there. I mean,
we jokingly call Tel Aviv Little Babylon. So
Jews in Israel call it Little Babylon.
Well, there's a Dag Nachash song about this guy who moves from Jerusalem to Babylon, and he means Tel Aviv.
So there's no doubt there are things that are wrong, but still he is bringing his people. Right. He's fulfilling his promises that he made by the mouth of Moses and Jeremiah in disrespectful of
this is beautiful. He's saying, I see your sin, but I'm still going to gather you back because it's my promise to the ancestors. He says, look, I see your sin and you're going to get paid for that sin, but I'm going to gather you back because that's the promise. That's the fulfillment. That's the sign that Jeremiah is a true prophet and Moses is a true prophet. The sign that I am true to my covenant that I made with your ancestors, not because you deserve it, you don't deserve it, but because of we call it the zchut, the merit of the ancestors, that he made this covenant. And that's what it says in Deuteronomy. Don't say that God's doing this because you deserve it. You don't. It's because he made this covenant with your ancestors because Abraham had faith and obeyed, and your ancestors had faith and obey, and therefore he makes this covenant so you can be a light to the peoples, which is, what Isaiah talks about, to be a light to the nation. It's not for you. It's so God can show his power in the world, that he's a true God. Show the world, I've chosen this people to show the world what I do. And I don't see how anybody can look at the history of the world, can look at the return of Soviet Jewry, the return of the Yemenite Jewry, the return of Jews from the ovens of Auschwitz to the land of Israel, and not see a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. I mean, it's true. The prophets are truth. It's real.
Now I'm going to continue on. Now, Nehemia, you're reading the Hebrew.
Yeah.
I'm reading King James. So if there's anything that is amiss with the translation,
can we jump to verse 19, or we'll never get to it?
Oh no. Okay. Verse 19. Okay, now. Okay. Oh Lord, my strength and my fortress and my refuge in the day of affliction. So it's speaking of a future time to Jeremiah. In the day of afflictions, the Gentile shall come unto thee, unto Israel, from the ends of the earth, and shall say, and it's more than say, it is cry out in repentance, surely our fathers have inherited lies, vanity, and things wherein there is no profit. Shall a man make gods unto himself, and they are no gods? It's like, that's what the Gentiles have done. The pagans, they've heaped together their own gods, their own creations, their own religions and all. And yet, when Israel comes back into the land, the prophecy is the Gentiles will come to the land of Israel. They will cry out in repentance, surely we have inherited lives from our forefathers. And it's because the Gentiles cry out in repentance, therefore. Right. Therefore, and this is the prophecy. This is the end time revival. Right. It is not churches filled to overflowing. It's not offering plates, filled to overflowing, and your preachers being able to fly in their private jets. That is not what it's talking about. Therefore, because the Gentiles come to Israel, cry out in repentance, and acknowledge we have inherited pagan gods from our forefathers. We have inherited those things that do not profit. Behold, I will this once cause them, the Gentiles, to know. In the Septuagint, we have different words for know, and you let me know if they're in the Hebrew there. I will cause the Gentiles to know. I will cause them to know my hand and my might. And they, the Gentiles, shall know that my name is the Lord.
The Lord. The bears.
Hold on just a minute.
The Lord.
After all this, the Gentiles repent, come to the land of Israel, and then finally find out his name is the Lord.
That's his name, the
Lord.
Lord
Is not a name. The Lord is a title given to every British landowner for the last 1,000 years. I pay my rent to my landlord. That's no great revelation, to know his hand, his might, his strength, know his miracles, and know that his name, the pinnacle of this revelation to the Gentiles, is that he will know that his name is. Now we have to look in your center margin in your King James Version.
You got a marginal note.
A marginal note.
But I don't think I can read that without my reading glasses.
Can you pick that up?
Okay, so it says, or Jehovah, and then it says Psalm 38:18. What is that?
Hey, okay, Nehemia. Hey, we need some help. We need to. The land of Israel has come to us right here. Okay. All right. Well, let's admit that. We see this, the Lord, all the way through here. Yeah. Oh, Lord, my strength. Oh, Lord, the Lord this, the Lord that. And then finally the Gentiles know that his name is the Lord. Wait just a minute.
And I want to back
Can we get a little
up.
deeper?
I don't even want to go to Psalm 83:18 because, I feel like we're running out of time. I want to go back into Jeremiah 14 just real quick. And in the Hebrew, I don't need the Psalms.
16:14?
16:14 starts out. It says, behold, days are coming, says Yehovah. They shall no longer say, as Yehovah lives. And in verse 15:4, rather, as Yehovah lives, who brought up the children of Israel from the land of the north. So throughout that passage, it doesn't say Lord in the Hebrew. It says Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, the name of the Father, the same name that was the first word Yeshua proclaimed after the resurrection, according to the Hebrew version of Matthew. That name, Yehovah. So if you change it to Lord, you miss the central message, right? And what is he talking about here? I'm going to show them my hand and my might. Look at modern Israel. That's the hand and might of Yehovah, gathering them back to the land. It's never happened in history before, where a nation was scattered. It's so unique in history, the United Nations doesn't know what to do with us. That people have been scattered throughout the world for 2,000 years. For 2,000 years, they're in diasporas throughout the world, from Morocco to India, to China, to Lithuania, to Ethiopia, all over the world, and then eventually in South America. They're every year praying next year in Jerusalem. And finally a miracle happens where they're gathered back to Jerusalem, and the United Nations says, oh, these are foreign colonists. What do you mean they're foreign colonists? We return to the land as a fulfillment of prophecy in the time of Jeremiah. This is our ancestral homeland. That's exactly what we said. That's the might of the Lord. That is the hand of the Lord. And it ends with, it says, and what's the result of all that? And they shall know my name is Yehovah. How do they know that? Because the people of Israel bear that name. So the nation, look at the progression here in these prophecies. The nations of the world will see the ingathering of the exiles and the survival of this Jewish entity in the land of Israel, in the land of their ancestors, and they'll say, well, this is not a natural thing. This has never happened again in human history. God is in this. It's a fulfillment of the prophecies. God's true. We've inherited lies. Let's go to the people in Israel. God needs to get the people back to Israel, the Israelites, to show the world that he's true and honest and the real God. And then the nations will see that. They'll look at that and they'll say, this is the real deal. We better shed the lies of our ancestors and return to this ancient God that spoke to the Israelites. And from that, they'll know that my name is Yehovah. And you don't need in the Hebrew to look in the footnote. It's there throughout the passage in the Hebrew.
That's right. How many times does it appear in the Hebrew text, the name?
Yeah, the Hebrew name Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh Yehovah appears 6,827 times in the most accurate Hebrew manuscript, the Aleppo Codex. 6,827 times. That's more than God, Lord, El Shaddai, and any other title you can think of throughout the Hebrew Bible. It's the most common name of God, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. And here I have to confess, Michael, and I hope we'll get to this in a future section, in a future program maybe, but I have to confess one of the sins of my ancestors. We had a job. It's one of those things where I gave you one job. Our job was to preserve that Torah, and through that Torah proclaim the name of Yehovah. And instead, one of the things my ancestors did, for various reasons that maybe we'll get into, is they said that name is too holy for us to pronounce. We'll write it in our scriptures and we'll preserve it, but we won't speak it, and we definitely won't let the Gentiles know what it is. We're going to keep this even to some extent secret from our own people, the true pronunciation, but we all know the name is Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh Yehovah, but we must not proclaim it to the nations. It's too holy. And in fact, a few years ago, the Pope, Benedict the 16th, he made a proclamation saying that in the Catholic Church, they have certain liturgies, certain hymns where the name Yehovah appears. And he said, out of respect for the Jews, so that we don't offend them, we're going to take those out. That's how bad it is. It's not bad enough that the Jews aren't proclaiming the name, but now they say, oh, well, we want to have good relations with the Jews, which I like that part. That's good. But out of doing that, they say, okay, now we're going to ban the name Yehovah even from the Christian liturgy, from the Catholic liturgy. And so rather than proclaiming the name in a fulfillment of this verse, we've kind of lost some of the details here. And to me, some of the things hopefully we'll talk about is how the things that are happening today with the knowledge spreading about the name are fulfillment of this prophecy.
We have to do that, Nehemia, because it is the Gentiles who actually came about with the name Yahweh, and a lot of, we see this all the time. I mean, the internet has given voice to absolute fools all over the world, and those who have no background in this at all. And so, but really the name was hidden, but in plain sight throughout all history. And you have now run into, how many manuscripts, how many places where the Jews have preserved the name, and also Gentile Christians have preserved the name with all the vowel pointing, so we would actually know and see this prophecy come to pass, that we will know that his name is Yehovah. That it wouldn't be any adaptation of it, that we would know because the proof is there.
Isn't this amazing, Michael? And I'm just realizing this as we're talking, so the development here is, I mean, this is something that's happened. We're seeing it happen in front of our eyes, the ingathering of the exile, Israel surviving the invasion of 5 Arab armies and the 6-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, wars that if Israel lost, there would be a second Holocaust. It's as simple as that.
Right.
I mean, they literally were at the verge of collapse at many points. And the world looked at that, even the Arabs, the Arabs looked at that and they said, well, Allah's not with us. This is, and there's this great quote from one of the Hamas leaders in one of the recent wars. And they said, our rockets are missing because their God is diverting them from its path. Have you seen that? That's amazing. Yeah. So even the world, even the Gentile, even the Muslims realize the God of Israel is doing something here. And the outcome of all of this, what it leads to in verse 21 of Jeremiah 16, and they will know that my name is the first word that Yeshua spoke after the resurrection, Yehovah.
Yehovah, Yeshua.
With archaeological technology advancing more rapidly than any period in recorded history, an ever-increasing number of ancient Hebrew manuscripts are coming to light, and amazing things are being revealed.
It doesn't matter what school you went to, where you thought you learned Hebrew, we're going to deal with things, ladies and gentlemen, that are revelation from heaven that have been set up for generations to come to pass.
Michael Rood and Hebrew scholar Nehemia Gordon reveal the fulfillment of ancient prophecies in our present age in The Gentiles Shall Know My Name.
I looked through hundreds of manuscripts searching for this exact text.
Will we listen to and heed this modern-day miracle, or will we ignore our Master's voice and miss one of the greatest revelations of our time? Order The Gentiles Shall Know My Name right now on DVD or Blu-ray. You'll get all 5 episodes as seen on Shabbat Night Live. Own this exclusive teaching now by phone or online. Hurry, this is a limited time offer.
Yes, prophecy is being fulfilled in the land of Israel even to this very moment. That prophecy that Moses spoke, that the nation of Israel would be scattered throughout the nations of the world and then would be brought back. Jeremiah speaking of that time and what would immediately be the precursors to Israel coming back into the land, and the time of great affliction coming ahead. And then once Israel is in the land, it's still not over. And the Almighty is wanting to make his name and his nature known throughout the entire earth. We then see the prophet Joel. Joel, who then details what is really getting set up right now. We're seeing the nations of the world now coming against Israel, the anti-Semitism, the anti-Jewish sentiment and spirit just welling up all over the world, through American universities even. And what is happening right now, we see that things are getting set up. In the prophecy of Joel, he speaks of an invading army that is coming into the land of Israel. Before them, it is like the Garden of Eden. And anyone who's been to Israel, been down the Dead Sea Valley, the lowest point on planet Earth, hot as next to Hades. It is so hot down there, but yet what do you see? Mile after mile after mile of greenhouses filled with vegetation that feeds the world. Not just Israel, but it's actually shipped to Japan and goes out all over the world to feed the hungry all over the world. It's like the Garden of Eden now, but when this army comes in, it's like the Garden of Eden before them. Behind them, it is a smoldering, desolate wasteland. Nothing can stop this army. There is no way that they can be impeded. And yet the Almighty calls for his people to call a fast, call everyone to repentance, to call upon the name of Yehovah. And it says that the Almighty fights from heaven for them, that the stench of their enemies goes up into the stratosphere. And then it says, in those days, it says the sun is going to be turned to darkness, the moon into blood. This is because of the war. It's not eclipses it's talking about. It's because of this war, the darkness, the desolation, blackness upon all the faces, the sun turned to darkness, the moon into blood, before the great and terrible day of the Lord come. And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call upon the name of
the Lord
the Lord shall be delivered. No, it's not the Lord. Nehemia, help us with this, because we have, do we not have Peter on the day of Shavuot also quoting this very verse?
He quotes it verbatim, and definitely in the Greek, in Acts 2:21, it says, "It shall come to pass that whosoever shall call on the name of
what?
The Lord, and there it's the Greek word kurios.
Kurios.
Whosoever call on the name of the kurios shall be saved." And you have to wonder, so when Peter spoke these words in Jerusalem in the first century, and let's assume that he spoke the language that would be spoken, that would be used for a sermon, certainly a sermon in Jerusalem. If you were in the marketplace, you might speak Greek, you might speak Aramaic, you might speak Hebrew.
He's on the Temple Mount on the day of Shavuot.
He's giving a sermon. A sermon's going to be in Hebrew. So he's giving the sermon, and he's saying this in Hebrew. What name did he use? Did he say the Lord? Did he say Adonai? Or did he speak the actual name Yehovah? And if you look back in Joel where we started, it says in the Hebrew, "Whosoever shall call on the name of Yehovah shall be saved." Now, what did the original say? What did Peter originally say? I don't know. It wasn't there. But there's a really interesting clue, Michael. I want to show the audience something. So what we have here is a page from one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, there's two sets of Dead Sea Scrolls. There's the early ones that were put in the caves in the year 68 AD when the Romans came. And then the Romans came back in 135 during what's called the Bar Kokhba Revolt. This is from the Bar Kokhba Revolt. It's called 8 Hever 12, which means it was found in Nachal Hever, the 8th cave, scroll number 12. And it's a Greek copy of the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the ancient Greek translation of the Tanakh. And what you can see here very plainly, even if you don't read Greek, is there's one word that appears in this page, which is, again, it's Zechariah chapter 8, verse 23, which talks about 10 men of all the nations coming and grabbing, holding on under the corner of the garment of the Jew, saying, "We have heard Yehovah is with you." That's the passage here.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the name Yehovah, that's written in Paleo-Hebrew. Even though the text is Greek and reads left to right, when you come to the name of the creator of the universe, the Father, in Greek, they wrote Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh in the earliest Septuagint manuscripts as in Paleo-Hebrew.
Right to left.
Right to left, right,
Yeah.
exactly. And what happened is over time, the Jewish tradition came about of not speaking the name, and the Christian scribes said, well, we don't know how to write that word. That's some word we don't know those letters. We know every letter on this page, but these 4 letters, and they eventually replaced it with the Greek word kurios. And so here's the question I have. When Peter wrote this, and let's assume for a second that...
Or spoke it.
When he spoke it and it was written down in Acts, let's even assume it was written in Greek. It was probably, I think it was in Hebrew, Acts, but let's assume it was written in Hebrew and then translated into Greek or written in Greek. Either way, when it was in Greek, would they have done something different in the first century, writing in Greek a sermon quoting the Old Testament than they did with the Old Testament itself? In other words, when they wrote this in Greek and they came to that name, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, wouldn't they have just written it in the Paleo-Hebrew? Now, we don't have that manuscript of Acts in Hebrew. It doesn't exist as far as I know, right? Where it's written in Greek but with Paleo-Hebrew.
You're one of the few people on the planet who would know, who's done the search.
I haven't found that one yet.
Okay.
Maybe one day. I hope so. But in any event, even if they wrote it in Greek or translated it into Greek, they would have written the name Yehovah in Paleo-Hebrew and then eventually changed it with Lord. And this is an important point because I deal with some Christians who will say, well, Nehemia, you're not one of us, you're not a Christian, so you don't understand. Every word in the Greek New Testament is God-breathed. Every Greek word. And if you try to say that the original was Hebrew, you're saying it's just a translation. Well, the church fathers said it was a translation. Papias said in the first century, I quote it in my book, Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus, he said, Matthew wrote the words in the Hebrew language and each translated them as he was able. That's the earliest testimony of the Gospel of Matthew from around the year 100, give or take, from this man named Papias, a church father. So this isn't Nehemia, the non-believer, who's saying this. This is the church father saying it, that some of these words at least were written in Hebrew and then translated. And so I don't want to get into your theology.
Other church fathers said that they saw the Hebrew Matthew.
Jerome says in the 5th century, he was in Caesarea Maritima on the shore of what today is Israel, and he saw a copy of the Hebrew version of the Gospel of Matthew. So we know there were Hebrew documents that were translated into Greek. unless you just think the church fathers made it all up, which some scholars do. But if you believe the earliest testimony we have of these gospels, that some of them were written in Hebrew and translated into Greek, and that definitely seems to be the case from the internal evidence. I talk about that in the book Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus. I think, and I can't prove it because I don't have the original document, but it makes sense to me that the earliest Greek version of Acts would have been just like the Greek version of Joel, which was written in Greek until it got to the name and it was written in Paleo-Hebrew. And over time, we know that in the Joel, it was replaced with kurios in the Greek, not in the Hebrew. And presumably the same thing happened in Acts, that when they came to that name, Yehovah, they changed it to Lord, because they did the same thing in the Old Testament. And so it should come to pass, who shall call in the name of the Lord shall be saved. But what Peter spoke in the first century, it makes sense that this would have been Yehovah, certainly to the audience. Now, this is one of the...
And again, Yeshua's first words,
Yehovah Yoshia.
Yoshia.
Right. Now, Michael, one of the things I've heard from and I'm talking about like I'm not talking about like internet stuff. I'm talking about like solid Christian scholars. In fact, there was a man who wrote a book called Yahweh at Patmos. And Yahweh of Patmos, written by Professor Sean McDonough in 1999. And this is considered the definitive work in Christian scholarship that proves that Jesus Christ never spoke the name Yehovah or Yahweh. He's not even dealing with how to pronounce it. He's saying that name, which in later Jewish tradition was forbidden, that Jesus followed the ban on speaking the name. He argues this in a book. It's a great book. I've read it. And it has some wonderful things in it. But I think one of the things he's missing is what we just saw, which is that in the earliest manuscripts where they wrote in Greek, when it came to the name, they wrote it as Yud-He-Vav-He, as Yehovah, in Paleo-Hebrew, and it was the Christian Gentile scribes who replaced that with Lord. So I think he misses that point. But, one of the things I shared with you, Michael, is that I've come across in my research, we talked about Hebrew Matthew. Well, recently I discovered a Hebrew manuscript of the book of Revelation. And this Hebrew Revelation, it's only a chapter and a half. But one of the really...
That's all that's extant.
That's all that I found. That's all, that's all that I know of. It's, and the beauty of it is today anybody can go online to the British Library, which used to be the British Museum Library, go to the British Library website. It's part of a worldwide project of digitizing all Hebrew manuscripts. And this manuscript is called Sloan 273. And let me pull it up here. I have it right in front of me, and we'll show it here on the screen. And let me just see here real quick. And the beautiful thing here is in this passage in Revelation. And can you read me Revelation? I believe it's 1:4. What do you have there in Revelation 1:4? Read me that from the Greek. And this is actually the basis of the idea of Yahweh at Patmos. Is he starts off and he says, look, Jesus at Patmos, when he revealed himself to John, he didn't use the name Yehovah. He revealed himself in a very different way. And I'm sorry, it's actually 1:8.
Okay, yeah, okay. This is King James. Yeah. I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the ending, saith the Lord, which is, and which was, and which is to come, the Almighty.
So here, according to the understanding of this Yahweh at Patmos by McDonough, and most Christian scholars, this is Jesus talking, and he's saying, I'm the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. That's what it means, the first and the last letters of the alphabet. And now was the chance to say that he's Yehovah, and he doesn't say it. And the beautiful thing here is in this Hebrew manuscript in the British Library. Now, is this the Hebrew original? I don't know. This is one of these manuscripts that shows up, and we don't know if it was translated from Greek or if this is an early Hebrew manuscript.
And it isn't. It's a mystery. It's a manuscript. It's handwritten. It is ancient.
It shows up. This particular manuscript, I believe, was purchased in the 17th century. It probably shows up. It was probably written about 100 years before that. And here's what it says in Hebrew. He says, "Ani ha'alef ve'hatav." I am the Aleph and the Tav. Omer Yehovah ha'Elohim. Says Yehovah Elohim, Yehovah God. So here he's speaking, the speaker here saying, I'm the Aleph and the Tav. And it's beautiful because in Greek it says Alpha and Omega, which is the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet. The first and last letters of the Hebrew alphabet are Aleph and Tav. Now I've heard people speculate that in the original Hebrew it wouldn't have said Alpha and Omega, it would have said Aleph, Tav. Okay, that could be. Here I have it.
Here you have it.
I have it in a manuscript. And then it says Yehovah God. And Yehovah there is written with the full vowels as Yehovah, not as Yahweh, not as Yahuwah, but as Yehovah from this manuscript. It's beautiful. And one of the things that's missing that I think is lost when you translate this into Greek is what you just read. And read that one more time, the end of the verse where he says, I am the Almighty.
Which is, which was, and which is to come, the Almighty.
Was, and is to come. When I hear that, I immediately hear that in Hebrew, which is the Hebrew phrase, Haya Hoveh Yehieh, which literally can be translated, he was, he is to come, or you can change the order. And in fact, in Revelation, it appears 3 times. Sometimes it appears he is, he was, or he was, he is. That's not important in Hebrew. But the meaning of the name Yehovah, the meaning of the name of the Father, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, is Haya Hoveh Yehieh. He was, he is to come. That's the translation, the meaning of the name. And it says it there in Revelation.
Right, 1:8, and it goes right back to when Moses was given the name. What shall I tell them your name is?
It's beautiful. Right.
Take us to
Right, well, so Michael, I was recently, and I do this podcast called Hebrew Voices, and I was interviewing this Samaritan leader, man who's written 107 books. Really smart guy. He's considered the top Samaritan scholar, meaning among the Samaritans. And I asked him the question which was obvious to me. I said, how do you Samaritans pronounce God's name, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh? He says, we don't pronounce the name. I said, really? Okay, well, how'd you pronounce it in ancient times? He said, we never pronounced it. Interesting, and we can get back to that maybe. But he says, but I can tell you what it means. I said, well, what does it mean? I know what it means, but what do you think it means? He says it means Haya Hoveh Yehieh. He was, he is to come. I said, well, why do you think it means that? I know why it means that. And he said the same reason any Jew would say. Exodus 3:14, God reveals himself to Moses, and he says, Ehyeh asher ehyeh, which literally is, I will be that which I will be, or I am that which I am. And that is from the Hebrew verb to be. And in the very next verse, he says, and Yehovah said further to Moses, thus shall you say to the children of Israel, and then he reveals his name, Yehovah, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. And what you have to understand is when you read this in Hebrew, this is patently obvious. When you have the prefix, the aleph prefix, as an Ehyeh asher ehyeh, it means I am. And when you have the Yud prefix, as in Yehovah, it means he will be. So Yehovah presents himself and says, I will be that which I will be. And he says, this is what you're going to call me. You're not going to call me I am. You're going to call me Yehovah, which is a combination of the 3 forms of the verb Haya, Hoveh, Yehieh. Even the Samaritans know that. Every Jew knows that. We sing it in the synagogue. I grew up singing it in the synagogue. Vehu Haya, Vehu Hoveh, Vehu Yehieh B'tifara. Every synagogue in the world, maybe they have a different tune and maybe they sing it better than me, but every synagogue in the world, they know that the name means Haya, Hoveh, yeah, and even the book of Revelation. To me, Michael, that's 3 witnesses. The Samaritans, and you can't tell me the Samaritans got this from the Jews, right? They say they have their independent line of information. According to 2 Kings 17, that independent line of information goes to the time of the time of Hezekiah, 700 BC. Right? They were broken off from the Jews from 700 BC, and they know what they learned from their priests that came from the 10 tribes is the name means Haya Hoveh Yehieh. Jews know it's Haya Hoveh Yehieh, and even the book of Revelation says 3 times it says it, that his name is, he says, was, is, and is to come. That's the meaning of the name Yehovah. So the actual name's lost in the Greek, but the meaning of the name appears. They didn't lose that. And the reason is there was no ban on the meaning of the name. The Jewish ban and the Roman ban pertained to the pronunciation of the name Yehovah, but the meaning of the name, I don't think the Romans even knew the significance of that. They didn't catch it. They didn't tie into it. It's beautiful. It's right there in this Hebrew revelation.
Oh,
and in the Greek, it's even there in the Greek. That's the beauty of it.
So his book, Yahweh on Patmos, what comes out of Patmos refutes everything that he says, that his name was not spoken coming from Patmos in Hebrew.
At least this Hebrew manuscript of it does. And one of the interesting things, Michael, I was curious because, look, I feel like when we're talking about the Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew, we're on really solid ground. We can trace it back definitively to a 14th century rabbi who copied it from some earlier source. With this Hebrew revelation, we're at the beginning of the research. I can't say definitively this is our Hebrew original. So out of curiosity, I decided to look at 2 texts of Revelation in Hebrew that I know they were translated from Greek.
Okay.
And one of them was made by a Christian Gentile named Franz Delitzsch, and the other was by a Jew named Salkinson who converted to Christianity. And both of them were in the 1800s. Delitzsch's purposes, he was actually a great scholar of Hebrew grammar, Franz Delitzsch. And he said, I want to present the New Testament in a style that sounds like biblical Hebrew for the Jews. The other one, Salkinson, was a Jew, and he had actually read the New Testament in Hebrew, and he said, this isn't Hebrew, this is horrible Hebrew. Some Gentile translated this, I can't even understand it. He said, I want to translate it in a way that my people will understand it, meaning Jews. Mm-hmm. And if they read it and they reject it, at least they'll understand what it says as a Hebrew book. So both of them independently translated the book of Revelation and the whole New Testament, by the way. You can actually get these online. Beautiful thing is both of these are translations from Greek, and we know who translated them in the 1800s, and you can see them online today. And both of them translate verbatim, I am the Aleph and the Tav, Yehovah Elohim. Now, what that shows you, whether this Hebrew revelation is an original Hebrew text, or if it's translated from Greek, if you want to insist that, it shows that three independent sources all looked at the Greek and realized what this had to say in the Hebrew would be, I am the Aleph and the Tav, Yehovah Elohim. And what I love about Salkinson and Delitzsch is they were writing for Jewish audiences, and they didn't even occur to them to write Yahweh, because no Jew would pick that up and say, oh yeah, that sounds like Hebrew. They'd pick that up and say, so this is not a Hebrew word. What is this Yahweh? So they wrote it the way every Jew who had a knowledge of the name would certainly in the 1800s understand it was Yehovah. It's the way it's written in printed Bibles in the 1800s. And we'll talk about that in a different, if we have time. I think it's beautiful. Three independent sources. One may be in original Hebrew, maybe translated, I don't know. The other two are for sure translated. And all three say, I am the Aleph and the Tav, Yehovah Elohim. And, so this guy who's writing about Yahweh at Patmos, he's got some wonderful scholarship, but I have to disagree with his conclusion that that Yeshua was under the ban on the name. As far as I can find from the Jewish sources, the ban on the name didn't exist in the first century. The only people who followed the ban on the name in the first century were the Samaritans who never spoke the name, and we have evidence for that. And the Essenes who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, they believed the name was too holy to pronounce. The Pharisees actually had a teaching that when you greet your fellow, you must greet him using the name. And they explain what they mean. They explain that when you, they quote Boaz walking on the road to Bethlehem, and he sees the harvesters in the fields, and they're covered in the dirt and grime of the fields. Like these aren't people who are sanctified in the temple. And he says to them, Yehovah imachem, Yehovah be with you. And they say to him, Yevarechecha Yehovah, Yehovah bless you. And the rabbis say in the first century, this is the greeting of ancient Israel. This is the way that we are culturally, the way we greet people. And they bring another example from Gideon. When the angel sees him, he says, Yehovah be with you. And the beauty of the story there is that Gideon in Judges 6, he thinks, well, this is just a greeting. It's like he's saying to me, hello, how are you? And the angel says, no, when I say Yehovah is with you, I mean he's with you. Like he mistakes it for a greeting at first. But he's like, no, I'm not just anybody saying this. I'm, an angel saying this. Beautiful, beautiful things there. So the point is, in the first century, that's an anachronism to say that Yeshua didn't speak the name. There was a rabbi I've talked about in my book, Shattering the Conspiracy of Silence, and in the Open Door series, I talk about this. There was a rabbi named Hanina ben Turadion, who during the time of the Hadrianic persecutions, he was a rabbi, and he was burned at the stake by the Romans, we're told, for speaking the name the way it was written, meaning as Yehovah. Instead of saying Adonai, he actually spoke the name, and this was in response to the Roman ban on speaking the name. It started out as a Roman persecution. He said, if you forbid us to speak it, I'm going to speak it publicly. And it cost him his life. And the Roman persecution of Hadrian, just to give you an idea, Hadrian died, and so the persecutions continued up until the year 138. That's 100 years after Yeshua's ministry. There was a rabbi burned at the stake for speaking the name. So you're telling me Yeshua, when he was preaching in Galilee, didn't speak the name? And do we have time to get to John 17, Michael?
Nehemia,
It's exciting.
we don't. Let me stop right here. I've got to do this. Nehemia's book, Shattering the Conspiracy of Silence. You just heard a tidbit here. 100 years after Yeshua, the rabbis in the Galilee.
In Galilee.
The grave is still there of that rabbi
Sure
up
is.
in the Galilee, burned alive in the streets with a Torah scroll wrapped
wrapped in a
around
Torah
him
scroll.
because he was going against the Roman ban to speak the name. And that his name, the name of the Almighty, has been hidden basically in plain sight, but in documents never translated over into the English. Ladies and gentlemen, I was reading this book. I got it from Nehemia just before heading over to Israel. I was on the plane. I began reading it. And the third time, I was sitting there just weeping openly, and I said, I got to put this thing down. I just can't. I just can't be crying in this plane on the way to Israel because it is so beautifully constructed and in telling the story. And ladies and gentlemen, this is Bible prophecy being fulfilled. That's why we're taking the time to do this, because there is coming a time that not only the Gentiles but all of Israel are implored to call upon the name, the real name, not some kind of Gentile abomination, not some kind of stretching the wild imagination, but Nehemia is going to take you into manuscripts, never translated into any other language, things that have been hidden for centuries that has now been uncovered as part of Nehemia. This thing, as far as this project, this is brought to into the mix, thousands of manuscripts that have never been seen before.
Michael, I've had access to over 1,500 manuscripts that I've been searching for the full vowels of the name, and we'll talk about that.
1,500, more than that?
It's actually more than that. That's one collection in one library is 1,500, and because it's part of this worldwide project of digitizing all Hebrew manuscripts. The other thing I was accessing that I'll hopefully talk about is I have a database. It's actually on a flash drive that you get from Bar-Ilan University. I paid over $1,000 for it. It has over 100,000 Hebrew books in it. And I was able to search that for information on how to pronounce the name. And it's definitive that the Jewish sources say the name of the Father, according to its true pronunciation, is Yehovah.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is what we're doing. Right now, I'm telling Nehemia right on the air, I'm paying for that. Okay? The $1,000 I'm giving to Nehemia, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to let you get involved in it, okay? I'm involved, and here it is. Shattering the Conspiracy of Silence. Ladies and gentlemen, it's going out to you now. Be a part of history. Be a part of Bible prophecy being fulfilled. Nehemia, you got to come back. I want to hear about how Yeshua speaks the name and makes his name known. Would you close with the Aaronic blessing?
Absolutely. Yehovah Avinu Shabbat Yehovah our Father in heaven, thank you for this wonderful blessing you gave to Aaron and his sons. Yevarechecha Yehovah v'yishmerecha. Yehovah bless you and keep you. Ya'er Yehovah panav elecha v'chuneka. Yehovah shine his face towards you and be gracious towards you. Yisa Yehovah panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. Yehovah lift his face towards you and give you peace. Amen.
Amen. Well, Shabbat Shalom, Torah fans. Shavua Tov. Have a good week. We'll see you back here with Nehemia Gordon, and we're going to go right into Yeshua declaring the name and making it known to his disciples next week, Shabbat Night Live. See you then.